Amen. That was beautiful. Thank you. Will you join me in prayer? Gracious God, open my mouth to speak and open our ears to hear. Open our hearts to change. By your power and through your grace we pray. Amen. Thick and blue, tried and true, thin and crispy, way too risky. When I first encountered this phrase posted on the banks of a river that flowed into the small pond that was situated in the middle of my college campus, it had essentially no meaning to me whatsoever. I found the sign, not this sign, but something similar, in the very early fall, posted along a rarely used walking path that was tucked between the trees near the water. It had clearly been abandoned or forgotten from the winter season many months before. As a cautionary sign, it was wholly ineffective, because I don't believe that it was just me, a child of the desert, that would have no idea what the sign was trying to convey. Thick and blue, tried and true, thin and crispy, way too risky. This could have been some misplaced instruction to a hairdresser. I don't know. You know? So, for the benefit of all of the other desert natives in this room, I'm asking my winterized friends, what on earth is this sign referring to? Ice, exactly. It makes perfect sense in context. It's a beautiful rhyming phrase that's meant to keep you safe when you're out on your winter excursions. If the ice is thick and blue, it's okay, you can walk on it. But other than that, you're just asking for a pretty unexpected and uncomfortable bath. One of the things that most shocked me when I moved to colder climates, and this could be my desert heritage, was the near obsession folks had with ice all the time. When I lived in Western Massachusetts and when I lived in Chicago, my friends would beg me constantly to go participate in some ice-related activity. Ice skating or hockey or long walks on the frozen lake, which just sounded awful to me. I even had one friend who decided to take up ice fishing, even though none of us knew anything about fishing just generally. But over time, I grew to appreciate ice. Or rather, I grew to appreciate watching other people appreciate ice. Walking and playing on ice, I began to see, can have its appeal. There's something magical about walking on frozen water. It's exhilarating to feel like perhaps you've conquered on some level the elements. You've bested water, and you've bested gravity. And it's biblical. Walking on ice is, for most of us, as close as we'll come to performing one of Jesus' miracles. But as miraculous as it may seem, walking on ice can also be very dangerous. It can come with immediate, sometimes unexpected, and potentially deadly risks. Unless you know how to walk on ice with grace, or you're a penguin, it can be a tenuous and wobbly journey. It takes constant effort to try to maintain your balance and poise and some small sense of dignity. And ice can be deceiving. That phrase that we all know now, thin, thick and blue, tried and true, thin and crispy, way too risky, that phrase we all know doesn't always apply on the other side of the lake. What might be suitable to bear your weight when you start out might just be centimeters thick wherever you end up. You don't know if you might find yourself halfway across the lake, surrounded by ice that can no longer bear your weight. Without proper care and constant awareness, one wrong step can lead you into a dire situation. And a dire situation is exactly where we find the protagonist of our reading from Genesis today. Jacob, asleep in the wilderness, his head on a rock. I think it's safe to assume that if you find yourself in a situation like Jacob, if you find yourself searching for the most comfortable rock to serve as a pillow, I think in that situation it's fair to say that you're walking on thin ice. Unfortunately, this is not an unexpected situation for our friend Jacob. Thin ice, it seems, is where he spends most of his time. In fact, his propensity to get himself into tricky situations is woven right into his very name. In Hebrew, the name Jacob is usually read to mean supplanter, or the one who trips up, a name that comes directly from the story of his birth. Born with his twin brother Esau, Jacob, even in the womb, was not willing to come in second. And so, as the biblical story goes, Esau is born with Jacob latched firmly to his heel. Jacob did not require Esau's assistance to pull him into life, but rather Jacob held on so that he might pull Esau back, so that Jacob might claim the role and authority of the firstborn son. Jacob ultimately was born second, but the rest of his life he spent living into his name, Jacob, the supplanter, the one who trips up. His outright coercion begins when his twin brother Esau, who after working in the fields, came in and was famished. He begged for some food. Seeing an opportunity for gain, Jacob refused to feed his brother Esau until Esau sold Jacob his birthright. For a cup of soup, Jacob bought the power and authority and privilege of the firstborn son. In what could have been an opportunity to care for his older brother, Jacob resorted to manipulation and coercion. He walked out onto that thinning ice, lengthening the crack that divided him from his family. And rather than retreating to the safety of shore, rather than listening to the environment that around him that was telling him to change his ways, rather than returning to his brother what was rightfully his, Jacob stayed out there on the ice. And he kept walking. He took another perilous step on that ice that was thinning by the seconds. Because it wasn't enough that Jacob had stolen his brother's birthright. So he, with his mother Rebekah's help, he disguised himself as Esau, putting on his brother's clothes and telling his blind father Isaac that he was indeed Isaac's eldest son. And again, through deceit and manipulation, Jacob threw his older brother into shame. He stole the blessing that rightfully belonged to the eldest son. Jacob did not walk gently or cautiously onto the ice. He stomped past the signs that warned of the dangers and ignored all of the potential consequences. He trusted that, as always, the ice would hold him. But then the ice cracked under his weight. Esau returned to Isaac's bedside to receive his blessing from his father, only to find himself once again deceived and cheated by his younger brother. And Esau became enraged. He was so mad at this manipulation that his anger overtook him. His only consolation was knowing that he would kill his younger brother. When I was writing this, the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson came to mind. He said, "In skating over thin ice, safety is in our speed." Jacob ran. Jacob ran fast. He fled Beersheba, his family, and his brother Esau's murderous rage. He ran until he could not run anymore, until the darkness overcame him and he knew he had to lie down to sleep. Now we have come to know that place where Jacob rested as Bethel, Beit El, the house of God. We have come to know this place as a sacred place. But for Jacob, this was not a place that held any special meaning. It was not a place that he went intentionally, seeking protection or solace or guidance. It was just a place, a rest stop, a way station. And we have come to know that Jacob's sleep that night was sacred sleep. But for Jacob, it was nothing more than making the best out of a very bad situation. Out in the wilderness, resting his head on a rock for a pillow, Jacob would not have known what was in store for him that night. Alone, separated from his family, by his own tricks and lies, knowing that his twin brother was seeking him out to kill him, Jacob drifted off to sleep. And then he dreamed. He dreamed the most magnificent dream, a dream that was much more than a dream, that was more like a vision. It was real. He dreamed that there was a ladder set upon the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Up and down the angels ascended to heaven and back to earth, traversing the sacred stairway between the heavenly and the human realms. In that moment, in that vision, Jacob felt and heard and saw the presence of God who appeared right beside him. But why would it be that a trickster, that the supplanter, that Jacob, the one who had no personal relationship to the divine, why would it be that he would be privy to this visitation and audience of God? There on the run, sleeping on the ground with his head on a rock, Jacob had just come crashing through the ice. But it was in that experience that his life was changed. Now we know that heaven is not geographically up. And we know that God would not need a physical staircase to be immanent in this world. But there is value in the vision of Jacob's ladder. And it's an exhilarating vision. There are some traditions, Celtic Christian traditions specifically, that talk about the thin places. The saying in those traditions goes, heaven and earth are only 3 feet apart. But in the thin places, they're much, much closer. It is in the thin places that heaven and earth meet, that the distinction between the divine and the humanly collapses into one, where what is sacred and what is profane is indistinguishable. The thin places are where we can touch heaven and where the sacred touches us. Now, there are some geographical locations on this planet that are recognized by many as thin places. Stonehenge, the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, the vortices, and the red rocks of Sedona are just a few. But I imagine that we each have our own thin places, certain special spots where we find ourselves in the midst of something much greater, grounded, but in a different realm, disoriented and reoriented all at once, lost for understanding, but filled with meaning. Peter Gomes, a theologian from Harvard, writes about the thin places. He says the thin places are the places where the visible and the invisible come into their closest proximity. To seek such places is the vocation of the wise and the good, and for those that find them, the clearest communication between the temporal and the eternal. Mountains and rivers are particularly favored as thin places, marking invariably as they do the horizontal and perpendicular frontiers. He goes on to say, but perhaps the ultimate of these thin places in the human condition are the experiences that people are likely to have as they encounter suffering, joy, and mystery. Thin places are not just geographical locations. In fact, I would be so bold to say that thin places are rarely just geographical locations. When Jacob rested his head that night in Bethel, he was not greeted by God because he was in Bethel. He was greeted by God and with visions of angels ascending and descending from earth to heaven because he needed a reminder that in the bleakest moments, the moments of insecurity, of unknowing, of desperation, Jacob needed a reminder that God was there to offer guidance. Theologian Paul Tillich discusses the divine-human connection that can occur when one experiences what he calls the shock of non-being. That is the thin place that we experience when we come to face the reality of our mortality. For some, it is the connection with the divine that comes from the near-death experience, a car accident, an incident, or illness that results in a hospital stay, a life-changing diagnosis. For others, it is the loss of a friend, or of a partner, or of a child. God is there in the shock that comes when you're walking on thin ice, of your own making or of outside circumstances. When that ice can no longer hold your weight and you plummet unexpectedly into the freezing water. God is there when your life flashes before your eyes. But the shock of non-being isn't always bad. It's not always a brush with death or destruction. Sometimes the shock comes when we become hyper-aware of the largeness of the universe around us. When we realize that there is something so much bigger than all of us. And all that we can understand is how tiny we are in comparison. We know God in the greatness of the Grand Canyon, of the silence of a winter morning, of the smell of desert sage after the rain. God is in the knowledge that water that flows and freezes, can turn into snow and ice, water that can support our weight. That night at Bethel, Jacob had run. He ran as fast and as far away from his previous life as he could. He ran right out onto the ice, not knowing or caring whether it held him. And it didn't. But in his icy plunge, Jacob met God. And in meeting God in thin places, he was ready to be reborn. We all have our thin places, whether we recognize them or not. And while they might not be as vivid as Jacob's encounter, and hopefully they won't be as dangerous as an icy plunge into a frozen lake, you might just find yourself aware that heaven is just a little bit closer, and the call from God is just a little bit louder. How will you respond? All the people say,